Tonight we'll drift into a story that is less about excitement and more about the soothing hum of history told slowly, almost like a bedtime lullaby. You've come here to rest, so I invite you to dim your lights, maybe pull your blanket a little higher, and let your breathing soften as the world outside quiets down. And as you settle in, I wonder, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there in your own quiet space? Know this, you're in good company here. You're safe and you're welcome. If this calm journey helps you unwind, you might consider tapping like, or even subscribing, though only if it feels right and effortless, as light as the hush of a turning page. And now, let's wander back in time together, to the curious world of Victorian households. Imagine for a moment a quiet kitchen in the late 1800s. The gas lamps glow faintly, shadows flickering across the tiled floor, while the low crackle of a coal fire hums in the grate. A maid leans over an ironing board, the heavy cast-iron tool in her hand glinting faintly. But the object beneath it isn't a shirt or a tablecloth. It's a newspaper. Yes, a newspaper, smoothed under the press of hot iron. It sounds absurd now, doesn't it? Who irons paper? And yet, this was a daily ritual in certain Victorian homes, done with the same seriousness as polishing the silverware. The air carries the scent of scorched ink, faint but sharp, and you can almost imagine the crinkle of the thin sheets stiffening as the heat passes over them. Why, you may wonder, would anyone take the time? Well, let me tell you slowly, and you might even find the explanation oddly comforting, like solving a riddle before sleep. One reason, quite practically, was hygiene. You see, newspapers were passed from hand to hand, and in the 19th century people worried that germs might cling to the damp ink. To iron the paper was in their mind to sterilize it. It was almost like giving the news a clean bill of health before allowing the master or mistress of the house to touch it. And isn't there something strangely endearing about that image? The morning's headlines pressed flat and warm, like a peculiar kind of toast. In fact, I like to imagine a Victorian butler joking in his driest of tones. "Your newspaper is ready, ma'am, lightly browned, medium crisp." Is the closest thing to a hot pocket of information, really. But beyond germs, ironing also had another purpose. Ink at the time had a nasty habit of smudging. Picture yourself settling into a velvet armchair, eager to catch up on parliamentary debates or the latest scandal in the society pages. Without ironing, the black ink could bleed onto your fingertips, leaving little marks everywhere. On your teacup, on the cushion, even on your own face if you dared to rub your cheek. The hot iron sealed the ink into the paper fibres, making the reading experience tidier, more civilized, less messy. And isn't that just so perfectly Victorian? This was a society obsessed with order, appearances, and the neat separation of propriety from chaos. To iron a newspaper was to control even the smallest detail, to domesticate something as unruly as wet ink. As I picture that servant ironing in the half-light of morning, I can hear the soft hiss of steam, like a cat sighing in its sleep, and the gentle rustle of pages. It's almost hypnotic, don't you think? That repetition up and down, over and over, smoothing stories of empire and invention, scandals and theatre reviews. Would you like to know a curious detail? The practice was not universal, but in grander homes, especially those with fastidious mistresses, it became part of the morning routine. Just as the tea had to be brewed at precisely the right strength, and the toast buttered while still hot, so too did the newspaper have to be delivered not just intact, but purified and presentable. What fascinates me is the thought that history itself, all those headlines about railways, wars, discoveries, even the first whispers of the telephone, first passed through the heat of an iron before reaching eager eyes. News, like linens, had to be pressed smooth. I sometimes wonder what it would feel like to hold such a paper. Would the page be faintly warm to the touch, like laundry just folded? Would the edges curl a little from the heat? Maybe the faint metallic tang of iron lingered on the surface, mixing with the woody scent of pulp. It's a detail lost to time, but not impossible to imagine if you close your eyes now. And here's another twist. Some households even had a special device called a newspaper press. a clamp that flattened the paper neatly, rather like a sandwich maker. It wasn't heated, just a weight, but paired with ironing, it created a newspaper that was crisp, sharp-cornered and formal, almost like an official document rather than a casual read. Isn't it amusing to think that in an era when people were inventing telegraphs and planning railroads, they were still ironing their morning paper like a shirt? Progress and fussiness living side by side. The ritual might sound absurd to us, but doesn't it echo something familiar? Haven't you ever straightened a magazine, tapping its edges against the table? Or smoothed a paperback spine before reading? It's a tiny act of control before surrendering to the story. As we linger in this moment, the Victorian household wakes around us. Upstairs, the master clears his throat, waiting for his news. The maid moves with quiet precision, folding the ironed paper and setting it gently on a silver tray beside a porcelain cup of steaming tea. She walks softly, the boards creaking beneath her steps, and the tray rattles faintly as she carries it upstairs. I imagine her thinking, perhaps with a touch of irony, that the man who will soon read of empires rising and battles fought is utterly unaware that his headlines were freshly ironed like a cravat. But then, that was the nature of service in that age, to make the invisible visible only when it was missing. And as we drift further into this picture, let's not rush. Feel the quiet hum of the house, the flickering lamplight, the faint aroma of ink and coal dust. It's a scene at once ordinary and peculiar, a domestic quirk that somehow endured, at least for a time, in a world where appearances mattered more than practicality. Perhaps, in some ways, we still iron our newspapers. Not literally, but think of how we curate our newsfeeds today, smoothing out the mess, presenting headlines in neat squares, filtering, pressing, preparing. The ritual has changed, but the desire for tidiness, for control over information remains. And so, with the image of that hot iron sliding across the page, we close this first chapter of our slow wander. The paper is ready, the tea is poured, and the morning of 1885 hums gently on. And as we leave that warm kitchen behind, let your mind wander to the next curiosity. Now that the freshly ironed newspaper has been carried upstairs, placed delicately beside the silver teapot, and read by a gentleman whose fingertips remain miraculously unsmudged, we can let our minds wander to another quiet corner of the Victorian world. Imagine this: the clatter of cutlery in the servants' hall, the muffled hum of conversation, and the smell of something unmistakably comforting. Toasted bread baked slowly by the fire. Not fancy bread, mind you, but hearty loaves meant to fuel long days of work. There's a reason people in the 1800s spoke of daily bread. It wasn't a poetic phrase. It was literal survival, softened with butter if you were lucky, dipped in broth if you were not. But bread had its quirks too. Did you know, in the 1850s, bakers often used something called alum, a powder, to make bread appear whiter than it really was? It gave loaves a fresher look, appealing to the eyes of discerning shoppers. Never mind that alum wasn't exactly healthy. The Victorians, like us, often preferred appearance over truth. Doesn't it sound suspiciously like the food photography tricks we see today? That shiny burger on an advertisement, but a different creature entirely when it lands on your plate. I like to imagine the household maid cutting into such a loaf. The crust still warm, the knife scratching faintly against the wood of the board. She'd slice it thick, far thicker than we do today, so that one piece was more like a meal. The warmth of the bread, mingling with the earthy tang of coal smoke in the air, would be a comfort on even the dampest of English mornings. And speaking of comfort, do you know what people often spread on their bread? Dripping. Yes, dripping. The cooled fat from roasted meat. Imagine a smear of beefy richness glistening faintly, seeping into the porous surface of a slice. Not elegant, but filling. The poor man's butter, you could say. Victorian avocado toast, if you like. Humble, greasy, but surprisingly trendy in its own way. There is something hypnotic about these small domestic details, don't you think? The way food connects us across centuries. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear the crunch of crust, the faint chatter in the background, the muffled thump of boots drying by the fire. And yet, bread carried more weight than nourishment. It symbolized stability. In 1795, just before our Victorian story truly begins, there were bread riots across England. Prices had soared, wages had not, and angry crowds marched demanding the one thing they couldn't live without: a loaf at a fair price. By the Victorian era, memories of hunger still haunted people. Bread wasn't just food, it was peace, it was order. Doesn't it remind you of how we sometimes panic buy flour and yeast even now, when the world feels uncertain? As though baking bread with its steady rhythm of kneading and rising offers a kind of control, the Victorians would have understood that instinct completely. Let's pause here and imagine a different scene. Upstairs in the dining room of a more prosperous family. The bread there is finer, softer, perhaps even scented with milk or sweetened with honey, spread with imported marmalade, sticky, orange, bittersweet. It becomes more than survival. It becomes indulgence, a morning ritual paired with tea in delicate porcelain cups. That tea, by the way, deserves a moment of its own. The Victorians adored it. The steam rising from the pot, the soft clink of spoon against saucer, the fragrance of leaves imported from Ceylon or Assam. Imagine the swirl of milk as it clouds the dark amber, a tiny storm in a teacup, calming as it settles. Tea and bread, simple perhaps, but to many Victorians, the very definition of comfort. And yet how different the meaning was between the classes. For the wealthy, tea and bread were leisurely companions. For the poor, bread alone might be dinner, thick, dry, sometimes dunked in weak beer to soften it, because water wasn't always safe to drink. Can you picture it? A child's small fingers holding onto a crust, dipping it carefully into a chipped mug, the sound of liquid dripping as it's lifted. It's funny, in a quiet way, how bread tells the story of society, a symbol of wealth, poverty, hope, protest, all in one humble loaf. As the day wears on in our Victorian household, the newspaper has been read, the servants have eaten their dripping toast, and preparations for dinner begin. But before we follow them further, let's linger just a little longer on this humble bread. Imagine the smell, the warmth, the crumbs scattering on a wooden table. Doesn't it make you wonder? What will future generations find strange about us? Will they chuckle at our obsession with sliced bread wrapped in plastic? Or laugh at the idea that we paid extra for artisan loaves that looked deliberately imperfect when Victorians scolded bakers for uneven crusts? History, in its sleepy rhythm, circles back in such ways. And as the loaf is set aside, crust hardening, crumbs brushed softly to the floorboards, we take a step away from this quiet kitchen scene. Now, let your mind wander to the next curiosity, where the clink of plates will soon give way to richer, stranger tastes. Now, as we leave behind the breadboard and the butter knife, let's wander into the world of soups and stews, those quiet companions of Victorian kitchens. Can you hear it already? The soft bubbling of a pot on the hearth, steam curling upward, carrying with it the scent of onions, carrots, and perhaps a bone or two left over from yesterday's roast. In an era when nothing went to waste, broth was a miracle worker. The poorest families stretched scraps into something resembling a meal. A single bone, bare of meat yet rich with marrow, could flavour an entire pot. Imagine dipping your spoon, the liquid thin but hot, the taste faintly salty, slightly smoky from the fire. It wasn't grand, but it was sustaining. Do you know the year 1847 holds a curious little food milestone? That was when the first soup kitchen opened in London, providing bowls of broth for those too poor to cook at home. The idea spread, and soon charity and soup became almost synonymous. The word itself still carries warmth, doesn't it? Say it slowly. Soup. It feels round, soft, safe. But soups in Victorian England weren't only charity food. In wealthy homes, they marked the beginning of every formal meal. Picture a grand dining table, candles flickering, silver ladles gleaming. Turtle soup was especially fashionable. Yes, actual turtle. Imported creatures simmered down into a thick, gelatinous delicacy. Imagine the strangeness of it. Lifting a spoon of steaming liquid, knowing it once swam thousands of miles away in warm seas. It was the Victorian version of exotic fine dining, the kind that whispered, "Look how far our empire reaches." For those who couldn't afford turtle, mock turtle soup became the answer. But here's the twist. It wasn't made of turtles at all. It often involved calves' heads, simmered long until the meat and gelatin created a rich broth. Doesn't that sound a bit like the medieval Pop-Tart of soups? Odd in concept, but oddly beloved. Imagine the smell filling the room, a faint sweetness from onions, the earthy heaviness of boiling bones, the metallic tang of copper pots. The steam fogging the windows on a cold evening, droplets sliding down the glass. Outside, the fog of London lingers, thick, yellow, smelling faintly of coal, but inside the air is warmer, denser, comforting. And there was always bread, of course. Crusts dipped into bowls, soaking up the liquid. Picture that soft tearing sound, the way the broth seeps into the crumb. You might have done the same yourself with tomato soup on a rainy afternoon. Isn't it strange how something so humble connects centuries? There's another layer here. Soup wasn't only about flavour, it was about pacing, about ceremony. The Victorians loved ritual. Starting with soup set the stage for everything else. Even if the meal that followed was extravagant. Roast pheasant, oysters, puddings. The soup began it all gently, like the first note in a lullaby. Sometimes, though, the soup itself became gossip. In 1851, at the Great Exhibition in London, visitors marvelled at machines and inventions, but also at the display of portable soup. Imagine concentrated gelatin squares dried until hard. Add hot water, and suddenly you had instant soup. Doesn't that sound suspiciously like the earliest cousin of the bouillon cube? Or even the instant ramen packet beloved in dorm rooms today? Close your eyes and picture a Victorian traveller tucking one of these soup squares into his pocket before a journey. Later, on a train rattling through the countryside, he might drop it into boiling water at an inn, the smell of broth rising from the mug, steam warming his cheeks. A portable comfort in an uncertain world. Isn't that what we all look for, in one way or another? A flavour that steadies us, a meal that says, you are safe here, you can rest. And perhaps that's why the word soup itself makes us sleepy. The sibilant beginning, the soft ending. Soup. Like a whispered secret at bedtime. The household we've been visiting would have known many kinds. Broths clear and thin for the sick room. Rich meat soups for the family table, peas pudding, a sort of thick split pea mash, lumpy and hearty, steaming in a cloth. Even eel soup for those who lived near rivers. Imagine the slippery fish simmering in a pot, the smell strong but oddly beloved. It is funny, isn't it, how dishes that once seemed normal now sound bizarre, while our modern favourites might seem equally strange to them. Picture explaining canned tomato soup to a Victorian servant. You mean the soup lives in a tin, on a shelf, for months? They might laugh, perhaps envy the convenience. So let us linger just a moment longer by the bubbling pot, the fire crackling nearby, the servants wiping their hands on aprons as they stir. The master may never see the labour, only the bowl set before him. But in that pot lies the story of thrift, of care, of survival dressed up as ceremony. As the last ladleful is poured, and the pot is set aside to cool, let's drift onward. From the warmth of soups and stews, let your thoughts carry you towards stranger courses still, where meats and puddings wait to be uncovered. Now, let's step softly away from the bubbling soup pot and into the grander dining hall, where the true spectacle of Victorian meals often arrived, the roasts. Can you picture it? The heavy scent of roasting meat hanging in the air, mingling with coal smoke and candle wax. A joint of beef turning slowly on a spit, juices dripping down into a pan with a steady hiss, like quiet applause from the fire. In that world, roast beef wasn't just food, it was identity. England prided itself on beef in a way almost no other nation did. They even had a nickname for themselves, John Bull, the beef-eating Englishman hearty and strong. Imagine a Sunday afternoon, around 1870. Families gather, big or small, rich or poor, and at the centre of it all is beef, pork, or maybe a goose at Christmas time. Even Charles Dickens described Christmas as incomplete without a goose. The smell, rich and fatty, would fill the street outside, curling out of chimneys into the fog. Neighbours might catch it and feel both envy and hunger. But the way it was eaten tells us even more about the Victorians. For the wealthy, roasts were carved at the table ceremoniously, with shining knives and the master of the house making the first slice. Picture the sound of knife against bone, the clink of serving forks, the rustle of napkins. Plates gleamed, gravy steamed, and conversation flowed. For the poor, though, meat was rarer. Often, a family might afford only a little, a scrap of pork perhaps, or some salted beef. They stretched it with vegetables or with bread, or boiled it into stew. Even a bone could be used twice, once for flavour, and once again boiled until nothing remained but the memory of marrow. Have you ever noticed how smells linger after roasting? Even once the plates are cleared, the house carries that scent for hours, a heaviness that clings to curtains and coats. I like to imagine Victorian servants airing out the dining room windows, shivering slightly in the damp night air, just to keep the house from smelling perpetually of meat. There's a detail from 1854 I find curious. That was the year the first mechanical roasting jack was patented, a kind of clockwork machine that turned the spit automatically. Before that, children were often made to sit by the fire and turn it by hand hour after hour, their cheeks reddened by heat, their eyes stinging from smoke. Imagine the boredom, the drowsy heaviness of watching meat turn endlessly, like a hypnotic pendulum of food. Doesn't it make you sleepy just to think about it? And yet there's something almost magical about roast dinners. Think of the sound of crackling pork skin snapping under a knife, or the sight of golden potatoes, crisp at the edges, steaming softly in the middle, goose fat, beef drippings, the clatter of serving spoons. Even now, those sights and smells feel like comfort, like home. But for Victorians, the roast was more than comfort. It was status. To serve a great roast at dinner was to say, "Look how well I provide, look how prosperous we are." In contrast, the absence of meat could feel like failure, like shame. It's no wonder roast beef became something of a national anthem, celebrated in songs, poems and theatre. And perhaps you've noticed how every culture has its showpiece dish. In France it was delicate sauces, in Italy pasta and wine. For the English Victorians it was simply meat, roasted until the scent filled every corner of the house. Let's slow down here. Close your eyes. Can you hear the faint hum of voices around that table? The clink of a gravy boat being passed? The fire crackling as fat drips down? The whisper of knives cutting, carving, portioning? It's a rhythm as steady as rain against a window, lulling and calm. And yet, there's humour too. One Victorian humorist once joked that Englishmen cared more about overcooked beef than about politics. And honestly, can't you imagine a stern gentleman scolding a cook not for mismanaging the household accounts, but for letting his roast come out too rare? That's the beauty of these details. They're absurd and ordinary, and yet they anchor us. Just as ironing a newspaper feels odd but logical, so too does obsessing over the perfect roast. And when the plates were empty, the bones picked clean, what then? For the servants, it meant scraping platters, boiling leftovers into broth for tomorrow, maybe sneaking a nibble of crisp potato skin or a lick of gravy. For the wealthy, it meant leaning back, bellies full, conversation turning lazy, wine glasses half drained. As the candles gutter lower and the meat is wrapped away for another day, we step softly from the dining hall. The echo of laughter, the clatter of plates, the heavy scent of roast still clings in the air. But we move on, towards stranger, sweeter, lighter things. Now, let your mind drift gently, like smoke from the hearth, into the next course of our journey. As the echoes of carving knives fade and the air still carries the weight of roasted beef and candle wax, we find ourselves leaning towards something lighter. Dessert. The Victorians, with all their rules and rituals, adored puddings. Now don't imagine pudding as you know it today, a creamy chocolate cup you peel open with a foil lid. No, in Victorian England, pudding was a world unto itself. It might be sweet or savoury, solid or spoonable, steamed, baked, or even boiled in a cloth tied with string. The word pudding was like a basket that held nearly anything. Imagine a heavy basin, steam rising as it's lifted from a pot. The cloth peeled back to reveal a dark, dense shape. Plum pudding, rich with dried fruit, sugar and spices. The smell fills the room. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a faint sharpness of citrus peel. Even the air feels sticky with sweetness. And here's a delightful historical quirk. Plum pudding didn't always contain plums. In older English usage, plum simply meant dried fruit of any kind, often raisins. So when Dickens wrote about Christmas pudding, he wasn't describing purple plums at all. He was describing something more like a dense fruitcake steamed until glossy. Isn't it funny how words can mislead, like little tricks played by history? Close your eyes and picture a Victorian family at Christmas. The pudding is carried into the dining room with great ceremony, perhaps even doused in brandy and set aflame. Blue flames flicker in the dim light, casting shadows on the wallpaper. Gasps and laughter ripple around the table. Children's eyes grow wide, reflecting the fire. And then the first slice is cut, revealing sticky richness inside. Wouldn't it be curious, though, to taste one? Dense, chewy, almost heavy enough to count as a weight. Sweet, yes, but with a bitter edge of burnt sugar. A pudding that lingers on the tongue and in the stomach, long after the last bite. But not all puddings were so festive. Everyday puddings might be simple. Suet pudding, for example, made from flour, fat and water, boiled until firm. It doesn't sound exciting, does it? Imagine something halfway between a dumpling and a loaf of bread, soft, plain, filling. The kind of dish you eat not for delight, but for warmth. There's a quiet beauty in that, though. The steady comfort of food that asks for nothing more than to sustain you, like a wool blanket for the stomach. Have you ever eaten something so plain it became soothing? A slice of buttered toast when you're tired, or a bowl of plain rice when you're unwell? That's the feeling these puddings carried, a simplicity that calmed. And then there were curiosities like cabinet pudding, served in finer households. Imagine a delicate mould filled with custard, sponge cake, raisins, and perhaps a dash of rum. It quivers slightly as it's placed on the table, trembling like a nervous guest. Soft, fragrant, indulgent. In 1845, a popular cookbook by Eliza Acton described puddings in almost reverent tones, with dozens of recipes ranging from the humblest suet to the most elaborate moulded creations. Her descriptions read almost like poetry, gentle rhythms of flour, milk, sugar, spice. And isn't it soothing to think of recipes as lullabies? Instructions written not to rush, but to guide, slowly, kindly. And here's a touch of humour. Some puddings were so heavy people joked you could use them as cannonballs. Imagine soldiers at war, hurling suet puddings instead of shot. A silly image, but oddly fitting given their density. You could almost hear the dull thud as one landed. The pudding cloth, too, deserves a moment. Picture the fabric, stained with years of use, tied tightly with string, hanging in the steam of a pot. When the pudding emerged, it bore the imprint of that cloth, a textured skin like the wrinkles of an old face. There's something homely and oddly human about that image, don't you think? Food that carries the memory of the fabric that held it, and always the kitchen filled with steam, windows fogged, the air damp, the hiss of boiling water constant. A sound not unlike a steady rainfall, soothing and hypnotic, the kind of background hum that could lull even the busiest servant into daydreams. As you sit with this image, you might ask yourself, what would your pudding be? Dense and hearty, meant to anchor you, or light and trembling, meant to dazzle? The Victorians, in their curious way, loved both. And when the last spoonful was eaten, the plates licked clean, the servants would scrape bowls, wash cloths, and set the pudding basin back in its cupboard, ready for the next occasion. The sweetness lingered in the air, faint but steady, a whisper of sugar and spice clinging to the room long after the fire had dimmed. And so we leave that fragrant kitchen now, stepping softly past the basin, past the flicker of brandy flames, and into the darker corners of Victorian appetite, where stranger tastes await. Now, let your thoughts wander toward those odder delicacies, where curiosity outweighs comfort. The sweetness of puddings fades, like the echo of a lullaby, and in its place comes something altogether different, the odder delicacies of the Victorian table. Not every dish was comforting or familiar. Some were peculiar, startling even, though to Victorians they seemed perfectly ordinary. Take, for instance, jellied eels. Yes, eels, those slippery wriggling fish, boiled and cooled until the broth turned into a shimmering jelly. It was a favourite in London, especially in the East End. Imagine a stall near the docks, steam rising into the fog, the smell of vinegar sharp in the damp air. Bowls clattered, coins changed hands, and the sound of cockney chatter mingled with the hiss of boiling pans. Would you try it, I wonder? The gelatin glistening, wobbling, tasting faintly of river mud and sharp vinegar. A Victorian version of fast food eaten standing up, hearty and cheap. The closest thing to a hot pocket for dock workers, perhaps, though far less convenient to picture in your hand. And yet there's something hypnotic about the thought of it. The shine of the jelly under gaslight, the way the eel flesh tore softly under a fork. In 1844, one London paper even described eel shops as the people's banquets, a reminder that oddity and comfort often go hand in hand. But eels were not alone. Victorians were adventurous with what we might call nose-to-tail eating. Calves' heads, for instance, were boiled and served with brains still intact, a delicacy to some, a horror to others. Imagine a grand dining table, silver platters gleaming, and there in the centre a head, glazed and decorated, eyes closed as if in sleep. Doesn't it feel unsettling, almost theatrical? And yet diners carved into it without hesitation, scooping out rich fatty meat, praising its tenderness. For them, it was no stranger than our own love for burgers or hot dogs, foods that are, if we think too long, just as peculiar in their origins. Another odd delight was potted meat, scraps of beef or game cooked down with butter, pressed into little pots and sealed with fat. Smooth on top, rich beneath, it was spread on bread like a savoury jam. The kind of food that kept for weeks, ready to be pulled out for a quick bite. Doesn't that sound suspiciously like a Victorian version of pâté? Or perhaps the ancestor of canned meat spreads today? There's a faint hum of practicality in these dishes. Waste nothing, use everything, preserve what you can. The rhythm of survival disguised as cuisine. And then there were oysters. Not so strange to us, but here's the surprise. In the Victorian era, oysters were cheap, the food of the poor. Picture barrels of them hauled into London, sold by street hawkers shouting in the fog. Workers slurping them raw with a splash of vinegar standing in the cold, shells crunching underfoot. Today, oysters are luxury. Then, they were every day. Isn't it curious how fortunes of food change, as if they have reputations of their own? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking those damp cobbled streets. Gas lamps flicker above. The fog presses close, thick and yellow. Somewhere nearby you hear the hiss of a hot pan, the splash of vinegar, the metallic clink of coins, and in your hand a bowl of something steaming, odd, pungent but filling. Food has a way of anchoring us, even when it surprises. These oddities, strange to us, were comfort to them. A gelid eel was warmth after a long day's work. A calf's head was a feast to mark a holiday. A pot of preserved meat was security, ready when hunger struck. And don't we still seek the same? Maybe not in eel jelly, but in instant noodles, or tinned beans, or a frozen pizza waiting quietly in the freezer. The names and tastes change, but the feeling, that quiet relief of having food close at hand, never really does. There's humour too in the contrast. Imagine serving a plate of jellied eel at a modern dinner party, watching your guests squirm politely, smile tightly, perhaps poke at it with a fork before retreating to the bread rolls. Yet in 1850, it would have been the most ordinary dish on the table. Isn't history funny that way? What we call strange today was once normal, and what we treasure now might one day make future diners wrinkle their noses. So let's leave the eel shops behind, their steam fading into the fog, the clatter of bowls growing faint. We step away from the peculiar, knowing that the Victorians, in their endless curiosity and thrift, found comfort even in the oddest of bites. And now, as we wander onward, let your thoughts drift toward the next surprise. The street foods that made city nights hum with life. The clatter of oyster shells and the shimmer of jellied eels still linger faintly in the air, but now the scene shifts. Imagine stepping outside into the streets of Victorian London at night. Gas lamps glow weakly in the fog, their halos soft and yellow. The cobblestones glisten with damp, each step echoing in the hush. And from the corners, from little stalls and carts, comes the smell of food. Street food in the 19th century was not glamorous, not photographed for cookbooks, but it was alive with character. Vendors cried out their wares in sing-song voices, the kind that rose and fell like music over the crowd. Hot chestnuts, they called. paper cones filled with smoky, steaming nuts warming cold hands. Can you hear the faint crackle of their shells, the scent sweet and nutty, the comforting sound of someone blowing gently on a too-hot bite before chewing? Picture a tired worker, coat collar pulled up, stopping at a chestnut cart. He holds the cone close to his chest as if hugging the warmth, steam fogging his glasses. Around him, others laugh softly, coins clink, horses snort and shuffle in the gloom. It is both bustling and strangely intimate, the kind of moment where the world feels smaller, contained by firelight and food. And then there were whelks, small sea snails boiled and sold with vinegar. Imagine the little stall, bowls of steaming shells, the tang of salt water rising into the mist. The vendor pries one open with a pin, offers it with a grin, and the customer slurps it down, briny and chewy. Odd to us, perhaps, but for Victorians it was as ordinary as buying fish and chips is today. Ah yes, fish and chips, another gift of Victorian street food. Born in the 1860s, when fried fish sellers and potato vendors joined forces, imagine it, paper parcels rustling, the smell of hot oil, vinegar splashed generously, crisp batter cracking under a bite, soft potato inside its golden crust, steam rising into the cool night air. Even then, people called it poor man's dinner, cheap and filling. Who could have guessed it would become a national treasure, a comfort food so enduring that even today, its smell alone can pull you into memory. There is something soothing about the idea of food eaten standing, wrapped in paper, fingers greasy, faces lit by lamplight. No ceremony, no silver spoons, just the warmth of fried fish or roasted nuts against the cold. Let's slow here. Imagine the soundscape. The faint hiss of oil, the shuffle of boots, the distant clop of horse hooves, the hiss of a vendor pouring hot tea from a battered tin pot, cups clinking, the fog muffling it all so that every sound seems closer, softer, like a lullaby sung through cloth. And think of the simple sweets. Peppermint sticks, barley sugar twisted into bright spirals, licorice black and shiny. Children's laughter rings out as they clutch their prizes, sticky fingers clinging to their mother's skirts. Isn't it curious how even the humblest treat could light up a child's night? A newspaper from 1872 once described London's night markets as the pulse of the poor man's supper. That phrase has always struck me as oddly tender. The pulse, the beat of life. Not the feasts of banquets, not the roasts in grand dining rooms, but the paper-wrapped fish, the hot chestnuts, the sticky candy. That was the real heartbeat of the city. And isn't it true still? We might dine in restaurants, but often it is the takeaway bag, the midnight snack, the warm sandwich grabbed on the way home that feels most alive, most comforting. The Victorians knew this in their bones. Close your eyes and picture yourself there. Fog clinging to your coat, a warm cone of chestnuts in one hand, the other holding paper filled with chips, steam curling into the night. Around you, voices murmur, the city exhales, and the night feels safe. There is no rush. Each bite is slow, steady. The warmth of food pushing back the cold, the rhythm of chewing mingling with the muffled lull of the street. And then, when the food is gone, only the paper remains, crumpled, greasy, tossed aside. The street goes quiet again, vendors packing their carts, voices fading, but the memory of warmth lingers, just as the smell of oil and vinegar lingers in the air long after the lamps are snuffed. And so we leave those busy streets behind, their hum still in our ears, their flavours still on the tongue. As the fog grows thicker and the city sleeps, let your mind drift now toward quieter pleasures, the drinks that soothed the Victorians and perhaps soothed their dreams. The streets quieten now, the vendors pack away their carts, the gas lamps flicker, and the night air grows colder. What remains is the soft hum of taverns and parlours, places where warmth is poured not from plates but from cups. Drinks, after all, carried as much comfort as food in the Victorian world. Imagine stepping into a tavern on a foggy evening. The door creaks, the air rushes in, warm, heavy with smoke, a tang of ale and roasting meat. The murmur of voices rises, punctuated by laughter and the clink of mugs. Somewhere, a fiddle scrapes a cheerful tune, the fire crackles, its glow painting the walls in amber. Ale was everywhere, cheaper than clean water. Brewed dark and hearty, it was drunk by labourers after long days, by servants stealing a sip in back kitchens, even by children, watered down. The taste? Malty, earthy, slightly bitter, with a foam that clung to lips. Imagine the way it warmed the stomach, a heaviness that dulled hunger, a soft fog of its own. And then there was porter, a kind of beer brewed especially strong, named for the porters who carried goods along the docks. Thick, black, rich. A working man's drink, but beloved by many. Picture the shine of it in the candlelight, the way it caught the glow like ink swirling in a glass. Winer, of course, had its place too, though more among the wealthy. A decanter gleaming on a sideboard, ruby liquid glowing within, the quiet ritual of pouring it slow and steady into crystal glasses, sip by sip, conversation growing warmer, softer. But one drink sat above them all in Victorian homes, tea. We touched on it earlier with bread, but here it deserves its full moment. Imagine the kettle whistling, the pot warming, leaves unfurling in hot water, steam rising, fragrant and faintly floral, the swirl of milk clouding the amber, softening it, sweetening it, the teaspoon stirring, a sound like a soft bell. Isn't tea almost magical in its calm? The way it slows time, insists on pause. In 1851, Britain imported millions of pounds of tea, and the ritual of brewing it became woven into every household from palace to workhouse, a unifier yet also a divider, depending on what blend you could afford. And there was cocoa too, sweet, dark, exotic. Imagine children crowding around a mug, lips smudged with chocolate, hands sticky from sugar. By the late 1800s, firms like Cadbury were making cocoa a household word, a comfort at bedtime, a treat for the weary. The smell alone, deep, warm, like velvet for the nose, must have been enough to soothe even the busiest mind. For those seeking stronger comforts, gin remained the notorious shadow drink. The mother's ruin, they called it, for its hold on the poor in earlier decades. By the Victorian era, gin had been reined in somewhat, but its reputation lingered. Imagine small glasses in dim corners, the burn of it quick and sharp, a heat that travelled down the throat in an instant. A drink not for savouring but for forgetting. Hot drinks too carried their own peculiarities. Possets, for example, milk curdled with ale or wine spiced and sweetened. Imagine sipping something both creamy and sharp, warm but slightly sour. Odd to us, but once beloved, even given to the sick as a kind of cure. Close your eyes and picture yourself holding a cup. Maybe it's tea, the handle delicate, the steam rising gently. Or perhaps it's ale, the mug heavy, your fingers sticky with foam. The liquid warms you, spreads through you, softens your edges. Around you, voices murmur, firewood pops, a song drifts faintly. The world slows, quietens, eases. There's a reason drinks carry such intimacy. They're not rushed. A bite is quick, but a sip lingers. A cup warms the hands before it ever reaches the lips. It asks you to pause, to wait, to breathe. The Victorians understood this, even if they didn't speak it aloud. Isn't it curious how many of these drinks remain with us? Tea, coffee, cocoa, ale, wine, still companions to our days and nights. The vessels change, the settings shift, but the rhythm is the same. Lift, sip, swallow, sigh. A ritual as timeless as sleep, and as the tavern empties, mugs drained, fires banked low, we step quietly back into the night. The fog curls around us once more, cool against our cheeks. The clink of cups fades, but the warmth remains, like a small fire in the chest. And now, let your mind wander onward, toward the sweet and sticky world of Victorian candies, where children's laughter and jars of sugar waited in every shop. The fog of London still curls outside, but let us imagine ourselves now inside a small Victorian sweet shop. The kind with polished wooden counters, shelves lined with glass jars, and a bell above the door that tinkles softly as children slip in, coins clutched tightly in little fists. The air itself feels sticky here, heavy with the mingled perfume of sugar, peppermint and licorice. Each jar glimmers under the gaslight, barley sugar sticks, amber and golden, twisted like frozen flames. Rows of humbugs, striped black and white, sharp with peppermint when they melt on the tongue, and little lemon drops dusted with sugar that crunches softly before releasing a burst of sour, puckering sweetness. Can you see the children's faces, pressed against the glass, eyes wide, reflections shimmering in the jars? Each coin feels like treasure, enough for a small paper twist of sweets folded carefully by the shopkeeper, the crinkle of paper as exciting as the taste itself. In 1864, Fry's of Bristol introduced something that would change the sweet world forever: the first solid chocolate bar. Imagine that. Before then, chocolate was mostly drunk, but now it could be broken into squares, held between fingers, nibbled slowly. A revolution in sugar, small and sweet. Doesn't it make you smile, the thought of a Victorian child tasting chocolate for the very first time? Licorice, too, had its place. Black, shiny, chewy, bittersweet. Some loved it, others hated it, and still, it found its way into jars, into children's pockets, into sticky corners of handkerchiefs. Even today, it divides us, that strange root-turned candy. And there were boiled sweets, made in copper pans, stirred until the sugar turned molten, poured onto marble slabs to cool. Imagine the hiss as it spread, the smell sharp and sweet, the shopkeeper folding and pulling, twisting the colours together before breaking it into bright, hard lumps. The sound of them tumbling into glass jars like rain on a window pane. There's something oddly soothing about these details, don't you think? The repetition of scooping, weighing, pouring, tying paper bags with string, the shop bell ringing again and again, like a metronome marking the rhythm of childhood. And then, of course, there were gingerbread figures at fairs. Imagine a bustling market, laughter in the air, stalls crowded with bright sweets, gingerbread men with raisin eyes, hearts stamped with little slogans, "Be mine," one might say, iced in shaky white lines. Not unlike the candy hearts we know today, history leaves its crumbs behind in curious ways. For the wealthier families, sugared almonds and comfits were offered at dinners. Hard little shells that cracked to reveal nuts or seeds inside. They glittered in bowls like jewels, little edible treasures. And yet even the humblest child with a penny could still taste joy in a sticky toffee or a barley sugar twist. Isn't it fascinating how sugar itself was once a luxury, rare and expensive, but by the Victorian era had become an everyday indulgence? By 1850, Britain imported hundreds of thousands of tons of sugar each year. The empire's reach brought sweetness home, and it poured into kitchens and shops alike. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture yourself unwrapping a paper twist, the crinkle of the fold, the soft scent of sugar wafting up. You pop a sweet into your mouth, it clinks against your teeth before melting, slowly, steadily, flooding your tongue with flavour. Time seems to stretch in that moment, the simple pleasure of sweetness filling the air around you. And can you hear it too? The distant hum of children's laughter, the bell over the shop door, the quiet shuffle of coins on wood. The rhythm is soothing like the ticking of a clock, like rain tapping gently on glass. There's humour in it as well. Imagine a child's face scrunched tight as they bite a lemon drop, eyes watering, only to break into a grin a moment later. Or the sticky chaos of molasses toffee pulling at teeth, stretching comically as it's tugged apart. The shopkeeper, no doubt, smiling quietly at the small dramas sugar creates. And when the children finally tumble out of the shop, paper bags rustling, the evening feels lighter. Their laughter echoes down the cobblestones, the sweet taste lingering on their tongues long after the last humbug has dissolved. So we leave the shop now, the jars glimmering behind us, the bell chiming softly one last time. The air outside is cooler, but sweeter too, as though the sugar clings even to the fog. And as we walk away, let your thoughts drift towards something different. The breakfast that greeted Victorians each morning, simple or splendid, humble or grand. Morning comes quietly in our Victorian household. The fog is thinner now, the pale light of dawn filtering through lace curtains, settling like dust on the polished wood. Downstairs, the fire is coaxed awake again. The kettle hums faintly, and the day begins with breakfast. Breakfast for Victorians was no small matter. For the wealthy, it could stretch across tables, a morning feast of meats, eggs, breads, and preserves. For the poor, it might be little more than bread and tea, simple and quick. Yet in every home, rich or modest, breakfast marked the rhythm of the day, a pause before work or school, a moment of nourishment. Imagine the sound of bacon sizzling in a pan, the smell curling through the kitchen, eggs fried or boiled, their shells cracking softly under a spoon, toast held on long forks before the fire, the edges darkening, the smell faintly burnt, butter melting into its surface, pooling in small golden circles, and then porridge, thick, steaming, hearty, oats boiled in milk or water, stirred slowly until they thickened into a paste. A humble dish, yes, but one that filled stomachs and steadied mornings. A spoon lifted, dripping slowly back into the bowl, a sound like a soft sigh. Perhaps a little sugar sprinkled on top, or treacle if one could afford it, dark and sticky, swirling lazily through the pale surface. Tea, of course, was ever present. The pot warm, the cups delicate, the steam curling up into the air. And for children, sometimes cocoa instead, sweet and comforting, a small treat to soften the school day ahead. In wealthier homes, breakfast became almost theatrical. Picture silver dishes gleaming on sideboards, kippers, their smoky aroma filling the room, sausages sizzling, kidneys sautéed with butter and herbs, marmalade, sharp and bittersweet, spread on toast, honey, golden and thick, dripping from combs, fruits in crystal bowls, grapes glistening, apples polished until they shone. Can you hear the clink of china, the quiet rustle of napkins, the scrape of knives against toast? The room is hushed, the voices low, as though the world itself is still waking, stretching. And yet, not all breakfast was so abundant. In small cottages, a crust of bread dipped in tea might be all there was. Or perhaps gruel, thin and watery, more a drink than a meal. The contrast is striking, isn't it? A reminder of how the same morning could begin with abundance in one home and emptiness in another, just streets apart. There's something soothing in porridge, though. Its slowness, its warmth. Perhaps you felt it yourself. Spooning oats on a winter morning, steam rising, the quiet comfort of something so plain it becomes tender. The Victorians may have found it dull, but dullness, as we know, can sometimes be a blessing. In 1861, Isabella Beeton published her famous Book of Household Management, and she devoted careful attention to breakfasts. Her descriptions read like gentle instructions, urging order, balance, and calm. In her vision, breakfast was not rushed, not careless, but a ceremony of its own. Doesn't that sound almost like advice for sleep too? That ritual matters. That repetition is comfort. Close your eyes now and picture yourself at a small table, a bowl before you, porridge thick and steaming, a slice of toast warm in your hand, butter softening into the crumb, a cup of tea cooling slowly at your side. Outside, the city stirs, carriages rattling faintly, voices rising in the street. But here, in this moment, all is slow, calm, contained. And isn't that what breakfast offers? A pause, a grounding, a gentle beginning. Whether a feast of meats or a crust of bread, it was always the first act of the day, the curtain rising. As the plates are cleared, the fire tended, the house grows busier. Boots stomp, doors creak, the rhythm of labour resumes. But for us, we linger a little longer in that stillness, holding the warmth of porridge and tea as though it were a blanket. And now, as the morning brightens and the world moves on, let your thoughts drift toward the meals that broke the day in half. The Victorian lunches, simple or elaborate, that carried people from noon into the long afternoon. The morning's porridge bowls are washed, the bacon pans scrubbed, and the bustle of the day begins in earnest. Horses clatter over cobblestones. Children march off to school. Shop doors creak open one by one. And somewhere, as the church bell tolls noon, stomachs begin to rumble. It is time for luncheon. Luncheon. Even the word has a slow, almost musical sound. In grand houses, it was taken in drawing rooms or dining parlours, light but elegant. In cottages, it was called simply dinner, the main meal of the day, hearty and sustaining. The names differed, but the purpose was the same, to break the day in two, to rest, to eat. Imagine a servant carrying in a tray for a lady at her desk. Thin sandwiches, crusts neatly trimmed, filled with cucumber or cold beef. A small slice of seed cake, delicate and faintly spiced. A cup of tea steaming gently, the spoon clinking as it rests in the saucer. She eats slowly, leafing through a book, the sunlight catching on the lace curtains behind her. Meanwhile, in a worker's home, the scene is different. A pot of stew bubbles faintly, thick with potatoes, carrots, perhaps a scrap of mutton. Bread slices float on top, soaking up the broth. The smell is earthy, filling, less elegant but no less comforting. Imagine dipping a spoon, lifting it to your lips, the warmth spreading through you as the day's labour waits outside. In the 1850s, cold meats were fashionable for luncheon among the well-to-do. Slices of roast left from yesterday, arranged neatly with pickles and mustard. Perhaps a salad, though salad then was more lettuce and vinegar than the lush creations we know today. Can you see the neatness of it? Plates cool, flavours sharp, portions small. A meal meant to refresh, not overwhelm. And then there was pie. Oh, the Victorians loved their pies. Raised pies with crusts standing tall, filled with pork or game. Picture the golden pastry firm enough to hold its shape, the knife breaking through with a soft crunch. Inside, savoury richness, fragrant with herbs, peppery and warm. Pie could be elegant or rustic, a symbol of abundance or a simple family staple. For school children, lunch was often plain, bread and dripping, or a slice of cheese wrapped in paper. Yet even these small meals carried comfort. Imagine sitting on a stone wall, legs dangling, unwrapping a hunk of bread, the crust hard but familiar. A sip of weak ale or milk to wash it down, the chatter of friends around. Small, simple joys tucked between lessons. The contrast is striking, isn't it? One household spreads dainty sandwiches on silver platters, another dunks bread into broth. Yet both call it luncheon, both pause to eat, both feel the same satisfaction of hunger eased. And as always, there were sweets to follow. Fruit tarts, perhaps, or a slice of sponge cake, light and airy. By the 1870s, jam making had become common in many households, and luncheon tables often held jars of strawberry or raspberry preserves, their jewel-like colours glowing in the light. Imagine spreading jam on bread, the sticky sweetness clinging to the knife, the taste a small burst of summer even in winter. Listen closely now. Can you hear the soundscape of luncheon? The scrape of chairs, the clink of cutlery, the quiet murmur of voices. Outside, the world bustles on, but here, in this moment, everything slows. A slice of pie, a spoonful of stew, a sip of tea. Small rituals repeated each day, anchoring the hours like knots in a rope. There's humour too, tucked in the details. Some etiquette books of the era warned against eating too much at luncheon, lest one appear greedy. Imagine a gentleman scolding himself for taking a second slice of pie, even as he eyes it longingly. The Victorians, with all their rules, sometimes turned even the simplest sandwich into a test of restraint. And yet, the truth was simpler. People were hungry. People ate. The rituals softened hunger. The food softened life. As the plates are cleared and the afternoon stretches ahead, the world stirs again. Work resumes, conversations pause, and the rhythm of the day carries on. But for us, we linger in the calm, letting the memory of bread, pie, and tea rest gently in our thoughts. And so, as we leave the luncheon table behind, let your mind wander onward, toward the afternoon treats, the cakes and biscuits of Victorian tea time, where sweetness and ceremony met in a gentle embrace. The hours after luncheon drift quietly, the light softening as the sun leans toward its descent. By late afternoon, the house begins to hum again, for it is time for the most beloved ritual of all, tea. Victorian tea time was not simply about drinking. It was ceremony, performance, comfort, and gossip woven together with steam and sugar. Imagine the drawing room prepared, lace cloth smoothed over the table, porcelain cups gleaming, silver spoons lined like soldiers. A pot of tea sits at the centre, its lid rattling faintly as steam escapes, the air perfumed with the faintly grassy scent of leaves unfurling. And around it, the food. Small sandwiches cut into triangles, their crusts neatly trimmed. Cucumber, delicate and cool, its watery crispness surprising against soft bread. Egg and cress, sharp and fresh, tiny flecks of green dotting the pale yellow. Ham with mustard, thinly sliced, the heat of mustard sneaking through the softness of butter. Then, cakes. Victoria sponge, light and airy, layered with jam and cream, dusted with sugar that glitters like frost. Seed cake, firm and fragrant, the anise-like pop of caraway bursting with every bite. Battenberg cake, checkerboard, pink and yellow, wrapped in marzipan as if in a sugar blanket. Imagine the knife pressing down, revealing the bright squares like a toy puzzle hidden inside. Biscuits too, shortbread, crumbly and buttery, melting almost before the tongue can catch them. Ginger snaps, sharp and spicy, their crunch echoing like footsteps in a quiet hallway. And of course, scones, still warm from the oven, their tops golden, their insides soft. Picture the steam rising as one is broken apart. Butter spread first, melting instantly, then jam, strawberry perhaps, sticky and scarlet, and finally clotted cream, thick and luxurious, dolloped on top. Or should the cream come first, and jam second? Even then, arguments rumbled quietly. Devon against Cornwall, each insisting their order was the only proper one. Isn't it amusing how even the gentlest rituals spark debate? Close your eyes. Can you hear the gentle clink of teaspoons against china? The faint murmur of voices, soft laughter spilling into the corners of the room. The occasional bark of a dog outside, muffled by heavy curtains. The fire hums in the grate, casting a glow on the wallpaper, and the scent of tea, warm and comforting, drifts over all. It was not just about eating, of course. It was about connection. Letters were shared, gossip exchanged, stories told. The slow ritual of sipping and nibbling became the backdrop for conversations that stretched the afternoon into evening. A bite of cake, a sip of tea, a whispered confidence, and yet even the humblest families observed their version of tea. Perhaps not with Battenberg or silver spoons, but with bread and butter, or a slice of plain cake. Children rushed in from the streets, faces flushed, and were handed mugs of tea, perhaps sweetened with condensed milk if sugar was scarce. The comfort was the same, a pause, a sweetness, a moment of warmth. In 1840, Anna, Duchess of Bedford, is said to have popularised afternoon tea among the fashionable set, complaining of hunger between lunch and dinner. Her simple request for tea and bread blossomed into an entire social ritual, copied and expanded until it became a hallmark of Victorian life. Isn't it curious how something so small, one woman's craving, can ripple outward into culture until we all sip from its echo even today? And tea itself was empire in a cup. Leaves from India, from Ceylon, carried across oceans, dried and packed, poured into English pots. Each sip, though comforting, was also a reminder of the world's reach, of ships and trade, of fortunes made and taken. A complexity hidden in something as simple as amber liquid. But here, in this moment, it is only comfort. A cup warm in the hand, steam curling into the air, the slow rhythm of sip and sigh. Biscuits crumbling softly, crumbs brushed from lap to floor. Children giggling, elders smiling, the afternoon drifting on like a gentle tide. There's humour here too, in the little dramas of tea. The spill of cream on the tablecloth, hastily dabbed. The sandwich slice that slips apart, cucumber sliding out like a trickster. The guest who insists on 2 sugars, scandalizing her friend who takes none. Small comedies, tiny domestic stages, played out over cups of tea. And as the light fades and the last scone is eaten, the ritual closes. Cups are gathered, plates stacked, the pot emptied. The room settles back into quiet, but the warmth lingers, a sweetness in the air, a softness in the memory. And so, as the curtains are drawn and the lamps are lit, we step gently away from the tea table. Let your thoughts drift now toward the evening, where dinners, grand and modest, awaited with their own rhythms of flavour and ceremony. The sky dims now, the last light of day fading into the fog. Lamps flicker in windows, fires burn brighter in grates, and the air fills once again with the sense of food. Evening has come, and with it dinner. Dinner for the Victorians was often the centrepiece of the day, not only a meal but an event. For the wealthy it was grand, formal and carefully staged. For working families, it was simpler, hearty, and much earlier in the evening. But whatever the scale, dinner carried a kind of weight, the sense of day's labour closing and night beginning. Imagine a great dining room in 1875. The table is long, polished to a dark shine. Candles drip wax from silver holders, their flames swaying gently with each movement. The servants move quietly, placing dishes with precision. Conversation hums, laughter punctuates, and the scent of roasted meats, rich sauces, and warm bread fills the air. Courses with a measure of wealth. Soup to begin, then fish, then roast, then puddings both sweet and savoury. Imagine the rhythm. Plates arriving, plates removed, cutlery clinking in a steady dance. For guests, it was not only about eating, but about being seen, being part of the performance of abundance. Fish dishes were popular. Sole, turbot, or salmon, often dressed with butter and herbs. Picture the delicate flakes steaming as they fell apart under the fork. The smell faintly briny, softened by lemon or cream. The Victorians loved their sauces, anchovy, caper, oyster. Rich accompaniments to remind diners of the empire's bounty from sea and land. Meat followed, often in grandeur. A roast of mutton or beef, the knife slicing with ceremony. Sometimes even a boar's head glazed and decorated, its eyes fixed forward as if still watching. It was theatre as much as food. Vegetables were there too, though less celebrated. Potatoes boiled or roasted, carrots, peas, cabbages. They were not the stars of the meal, but they filled the spaces, softened the richness. Imagine the simple sweetness of a boiled carrot, humble yet steady among the sauces and meats. And then puddings, both savoury and sweet. A marrow pudding perhaps, dense and unusual, or a golden-baked custard, quivering slightly as the spoon dipped in. And for the finale, perhaps a fruit tart gleaming under its glaze, or a plum pudding carried in with great ceremony, flames dancing blue in the candlelight. Now contrast this with the dinner of a working family, perhaps a pot of stew carried over from midday, reheated over the fire. Potatoes again, perhaps bread, perhaps a little meat if there was any left. The children crowded around, bowls in hands, dipping spoons quickly, the food gone almost before the steam could rise. And yet, the comfort was the same. Warmth, fullness, a pause before bed. Close your eyes and imagine both scenes side by side. The grand hall with silver and laughter, the cottage with clay bowls and candle stubs, the clink of crystal glasses, the scrape of wooden spoons. Different worlds, yet both guided by hunger, both seeking the same comfort of a full stomach as the night draws in. Dinner was also ritualized in etiquette books. Mrs. Beeton gave pages of instruction on how to serve, what order dishes should arrive, how servants should move. Imagine the precision of it. No fork out of place, no sauce spilled, no guest left waiting. The formality itself became a kind of lullaby, predictable and reassuring. And yet, for all the pomp, there was always a human softness beneath. Someone sneaking an extra spoonful of custard. A child yawning at the table, barely awake enough to finish their pudding. A servant tasting a bit of potato in the kitchen, savouring it quietly in the hum of labour. Listen closely now. Can you hear it? The scrape of knives against plates, the low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of glasses filled, corks popping, firewood shifting in the grate. It is the sound of evening settling, of bodies softening after the day. There is humour too in the excess. One writer in 1860 joked that Victorian dinner courses were like chapters in a novel, some thrilling, some dull, but you had to get through them all to reach dessert. And perhaps you felt the same at a long meal, waiting patiently for the sweets while nodding politely at the fish. And so, as the last plates are cleared and the candles gutter lower, the room grows quieter. The servants collect dishes, the guests drift toward parlours for conversation or music. The fire burns steady. Dinner has ended, but its warmth lingers, in the stomach, in the air, in the memory of flavours shared. And now, as the night deepens, let your mind wander with me toward what followed. The late-night indulgences, the suppers and snacks that kept the Victorians company before bed. The candles have burned low, the heavy dishes of dinner cleared away. In the grand homes, guests have drifted to parlours for music, cards, or quiet talk. In humbler houses, the fire is banked, children tucked into bed. Yet even so, the day often ended with one more small ritual: supper. Supper was not the formality of dinner, nor the sustenance of luncheon. It was something gentler, lighter, a bridge between evening and sleep. Picture a tray carried in with slices of cold meat, perhaps a wedge of cheese, some bread, and a glass of ale or wine. Not a feast, but a whisper of food, meant to soothe rather than to impress. For some, supper might be as simple as porridge, reheated from the morning, eaten by the fire with spoons clinking softly. Imagine the steam rising again, the same oats made softer by the day's hunger, the comfort of repetition. For others, it might be bread and butter, perhaps sweetened with honey, a humble but tender close to the day. In wealthier homes, supper could be surprisingly grand, though still gentler than dinner. Cold game pies, slices of ham, anchovy toast, custards or syllabub, a frothy mixture of cream, wine and sugar, light and airy as a dream. Picture it trembling slightly in the spoon, dissolving almost at once on the tongue. And sometimes there was simply a glass of warm milk, perhaps spiced with nutmeg, offered as a tonic for sleep. Doesn't that sound familiar, even today? The idea that a warm drink can soften the edges of wakefulness, guiding the body toward rest. There's a soothing rhythm in these late-night bites. The clink of knives against cold platters, the whisper of bread being sliced, the pop of a cork. Quiet sounds in a quiet house, soft as lullabies. In boarding schools too, supper carried its role. Children lined up for mugs of cocoa, their chatter fading into yawns as the day ended. Imagine the rows of small hands cupping mugs, steam fogging their spectacles, the chocolate scent filling the dormitory air. A memory stitched into childhood, as familiar as the creak of beds and the hush of prayers before lights out. And in taverns, supper meant something else again. Late-night revellers ordering a plate of oysters, or a pie, or even just bread and ale before stumbling into the foggy streets. Laughter too loud, songs spilling out into the night. A supper less about comfort, more about prolonging the day. But the gentlest image of all is that of a small household, a candle flickering on the table, a mother pouring warm milk for her children, a father breaking bread into pieces to share. No performance, no excess, just the quiet act of ending the day together. There's humour in supper too, of course. One etiquette writer warned against eating heavy food late at night, lest one disturb the digestion. Imagine a solemn gentleman refusing a slice of pie at supper, only to sneak down later for it in secret, caught by the cook in his dressing gown. Even the Victorians, with all their rules, could not always resist a midnight treat. And isn't that still true for us? The quiet comfort of opening the fridge at night, of finding a leftover slice of cake or a piece of cheese, of eating it in the hush of the kitchen while the rest of the house sleeps. Supper is as much about secrecy as it is about nourishment. Close your eyes now. Can you hear the faint hush of the house at night? The tick of a clock, the rustle of curtains, the low hum of a dying fire? A plate on the table, a glass half full, the quiet scrape of a fork. Supper was never hurried. It was meant to slow, to calm, to ease the day into silence. And when the plates were cleared, when the last crumbs were brushed away, the house settled deeper into stillness. Doors closed softly, lamps were turned down, and sleep drew near. So we leave the supper table now, the candle flickering one last time before it is blown out. And as the smoke curls upward and vanishes into the shadows, let your mind drift toward another corner of Victorian life. The grand feasts and banquets, where food became spectacle, performance, and even a kind of theatre. The hush of simple suppers fades, and in its place rises the swell of something far more elaborate, the Victorian banquet. Imagine not one table, but many, long and wide, draped in heavy cloth, candles burning in gleaming chandeliers overhead, silver polish so brightly it throws back the light in little sparks. Banquets were not about hunger, not really. They were about display, about spectacle, a chance for hosts to prove their wealth, their refinement, their connections. To sit at a banquet was to sit on a stage where every plate, every bite, every sip was a line in a performance. Picture the first course. Turtle soup, rich and gelatinous, carried in steaming tureens. The ladles dip, The bowls clink and the smell of the sea mingles with spices and butter. For those who couldn't afford turtle, mock turtle soup made from calves' heads stood in, just as thick, just as strange. Then fish, salmon perhaps, shimmering pink, laid whole on a platter, its scales glistening, its eyes glazed. It is decorated with parsley, slices of lemon, perhaps even tiny butter sculptures. Guests lean forward, admiring before carving begins. The roast come next. Enormous joints of beef, legs of mutton, even venison or boar. Picture the knife slicing into golden fat, juices spilling, steam rising in little clouds. The smell fills the room, heavy and rich, settling on hair and clothing alike. Conversation grows louder. Glasses are raised, toasts shouted across the hall. Between these courses come dishes meant less for eating than for admiring. Raised pies, tall and intricate, their crusts moulded into shapes, sometimes even castles or coats of arms. Trifles layered with sponge, custard, fruit and cream, their colours glowing like jewels under glass bowls. And then the pièce de résistance, the centrepiece, the grand dish that was meant to astonish. A swan, roasted but redressed in its feathers, wings spread wide as though still gliding across a lake. Or a peacock, its tail fanned, shimmering under candlelight. More sculpture than sustenance, yet it drew gasps from guests who had seen such things before and would see them again. Isn't it almost dreamlike, the idea of eating in such theatre? Each course a performance, each platter a stage. And yet, beneath the glitter, there were still the same human hungers, the same clatter of forks, the same sigh of satisfaction after a bite of pudding. Dessert at these banquets was its own world. Plates of sugared fruits, gleaming with frost of sugar crystals. Jelly moulded into towers, wobbling with each movement, catching the light like stained glass. Almonds candied and colourful, and for the wealthiest imported pineapple. A fruit so rare it was often rented to display at dinners, never eaten, simply admired. Imagine that, a fruit as a trophy, too precious to cut, perched on the table like a crown. The noise of banquets was something to behold. Knives clinked, glasses chimed, voices rose and fell like waves. Laughter rolled through the hall, punctuated by the scrape of chairs, the thump of servants' shoes, the occasional crash of a dropped dish. All softened by the thick drape of curtains, the steady hum of fire, the muffling fog outside pressing at the windows. But even amid the pomp, small, quiet moments lived. A child sneaking an extra sweet, a guest smiling secretly at a memory while lifting a spoon, a servant in the corner steadying a tray, sneaking a bite when no one was watching. The human heartbeat pulsed beneath the show. It's amusing, too, how often guests complained afterward of feeling too full. One magazine from 1863 joked that English banquets were tests of endurance, requiring both courage and iron stomachs. Can you imagine sitting through 12 courses, polite smile fixed, nodding at speeches, while longing only for a cup of tea and a soft chair? And yet, for all their extravagance, banquets echoed the same comforts we've seen before. Bread, soup, meat, pudding, sweets. The forms were grand, the scale immense, but the soul of the meal remained familiar. Hunger satisfied, conversation shared, warmth in the belly as night deepened. Close your eyes now. Picture the candles burning low, wax pooling on the cloth. The last dish removed, the last toast given, the last spoon licked clean. The hall echoes with laughter fading into murmurs. Outside, the city is still. Inside, the guests lean back, heavy with food, their thoughts already drifting toward bed. And so, we leave the banquet table behind, its silver gleam fading, its fire crackling low. As the hall falls into silence, let your mind wander with me toward the quieter kitchens, where servants, after long hours, finally found time for their own secret bites. While the guests upstairs lean back in their chairs, voices softened by wine and candlelight, another world stirs below. The servants' hall, tucked into basements and corners, comes alive with its own small ritual, stolen bites, secret suppers, and the simple comfort of food eaten after long hours of work. Imagine a scullery maid, her hands raw from scrubbing pans, pausing just long enough to sneak a crust of bread left from the family's meal. She chews quickly, quietly, before dipping the crust into a pot of leftover gravy, savouring it as though it were the richest dish in the house. Or a footman, balancing trays upstairs, managing smiles and bows, finally finding a moment to lift a slice of cold beef from the sideboard when no one is looking. He chews in silence, leaning against the cool stone wall, the candle flickering low beside him. For him, that bite is not a performance, not a display, just a need answered. The contrast is striking, isn't it? Upstairs, swan feathers and sugared fruit. Down here, bone scraped clean, bread heels dripping saved in jars. Yet both meals speak of hunger, of pause, of the body's quiet demand for comfort. In some houses, servants' suppers were planned, a pot of stew made from leftovers, bread distributed, mugs of ale shared. Imagine the clatter of bowls, the low hum of weary voices, laughter bubbling despite exhaustion, a kind of fellowship in shadows, where even crumbs carried flavour. And sometimes the food itself was peculiar. Tripe, for instance, the stomach lining of cows, boiled and eaten with onions. Offal of all sorts, scraps that never graced the master's plates, but became staples below stairs. The smell was strong, sharp, but for servants, it was nourishment. Isn't it curious how the parts deemed unworthy by one class become comfort food for another? Picture now the kitchen at midnight. The fire still glows faintly, its heat gentle now rather than fierce. A few pots hang forgotten, steam long gone. The room is quiet but for the tick of a clock and the soft scrape of cutlery on tin plates. A maid leans against the table, eyes heavy, spoon in hand, slowly finishing her bowl of porridge. Each bite slower than the last, until her eyelids close between spoons. In these quiet suppers lived small rebellions too. A slice of pie saved secretly, tucked away until no one watched. A sweet slipped into a pocket from the banquet trays, savoured later in the solitude of a narrow bed. These little indulgences softened the edge of labour, small victories hidden in shadows. There's humour in it as well. One account from 1870 described a butler who was caught mid-bite with a custard tart, fumbling to hide it behind his back as the master entered. It was less his guilt, the writer said, than the trail of crumbs that betrayed him. Can't you see it? A man of great dignity undone by sugar dusting his waistcoat. And yet there is tenderness here too. Imagine the cook ladling an extra portion into a younger maid's bowl, knowing she hadn't eaten enough. Or the quiet comfort of servants sitting shoulder to shoulder at a long wooden table, eating in silence. Too tired for words, but comforted by presence. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear it. The scrape of spoons, the sigh of exhaustion, the faint crackle of the last logs in the fire. A rhythm slower than the grandeur upstairs, but somehow gentler, steadier, more human. And when the bowls are emptied and the mugs drained, the hall grows quiet. Servants slip away to narrow beds, footsteps echoing in stone corridors. The fire is covered, the kitchen dim, the house above silent. Food, even here, has softened the day's edge, carried them into rest. Isn't it soothing to think that even in lives filled with labour, there were these small secret pauses, that amid the endless orders and chores a spoonful of stew or a bite of pie could offer peace? And so, as the servants drift into sleep, let us leave their quiet hall behind. Step softly now, back into the world above, where food was not only eaten but remembered, where recipes and cookbooks shaped the very rhythm of kitchens. The house is hushed now, its fires dimmed, but in another sense the kitchen lives on, not in clatter or steam, but in words. For the Victorians, food was not only eaten, it was written, described, catalogued, and passed down in the pages of cookbooks that shaped households for decades. Imagine a thick volume resting on a wooden shelf, its spine cracked, its pages stained with grease and sugar. When opened, the smell of old paper mingles with faint traces of cinnamon, butter, and smoke. Recipes fill the pages in tidy print, instructions both exacting and gentle, as though each one were a whispered story. The most famous of these, of course, was Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861. Nearly 2,000 pages long, It offered not only recipes, but instructions on how to run a home, from the boiling of beef to the conduct of servants, from cleaning silver to hosting banquets. Imagine turning its pages by lamplight, the flicker of flame casting shadows over words that guided entire households. Mrs. Beeton herself became something of a legend. Yet her work was less original invention than careful gathering, compiling recipes from other sources into a great orderly compendium. Isn't there something soothing in that? The idea that order itself, the act of arranging, can be a gift. Recipes then were not quite like ours. Quantities might be vague, a teacup of sugar, a goodly piece of butter. Instructions leaned more on instinct than on precision. Boil until done, one might read, leaving the cook to decide what done meant. The ambiguity carried trust, that the cook knew that experience would guide, and yet the rhythm of recipes has always been calming. Lists of ingredients like poetry, short commands that feel like lullabies. Take flour, add eggs, stir gently, bake until golden. Isn't there something hypnotic in those words, as though they guide not just the hand, but the mind into quiet? Victorian cookbooks also reflected their world. Dishes of empire filled the pages. Curries flavoured with spices from India, preserves with fruits from the Caribbean. To read a recipe was to taste the reach of ships and trade, to bring the world into one's kitchen. But cookbooks were not only for the wealthy. Cheap pamphlets and guides circulated too, offering recipes for families of modest means. A good stew for sixpence, one promised, or bread to serve the week. Imagine the comfort of holding such a booklet, knowing it held the key to stretching a little food into enough. Close your eyes now and picture yourself in a Victorian kitchen. The cook flips open a worn volume, her finger tracing down the page. The servants gather ingredients. The air fills with the sound of chopping, stirring, simmering. The recipe is less a rule than a rhythm, guiding their movements, shaping the day. And isn't it curious how we too are soothed by recipes even when we don't cook them? How flipping through a cookbook can calm us, the pictures and words offering a promise of order, of possibility. There's humour in these pages as well. Some recipes included curious remedies alongside cakes and pies, instructions for curing headaches, for polishing boots, even for managing unruly husbands. It was less a cookbook than an encyclopedia of domestic life, a reminder that food was never separate from the rest of existence. In these books you can almost hear the voices of the past, a woman noting a variation in the margin, a grease stain marking a favourite page, a folded corner where a recipe was returned to again and again. They are as much diaries as they are manuals, whispering secrets across centuries. And perhaps the gentlest truth is this, that cookbooks are at heart about care. Each recipe, however plain, is an offering, a way to feed, to comfort, to sustain. To follow one is to step into the rhythm of countless hands before, stirring and tasting in kitchens warmed by firelight. So let us linger here, in the rustle of old pages, the quiet weight of books filled with sugar and spice. Imagine the candle burning lower, the words softening into shadows, the recipes whispering like lullabies into the night. And now, as the book is closed and set back on the shelf, let your thoughts drift toward another corner of the Victorian table. The foods of travel and empire, carried across oceans, reshaping tastes and lives at home. The kitchen with its stained recipe books now seems far behind us. Instead, let us drift outward, across harbours thick with smoke, past ships waiting with sails unfurled. The Victorian world was one of constant movement. Spices, fruits, and grains crossing seas, bringing distant places into English kitchens and onto English tables. Close your eyes and imagine standing at a dock in 1850. The air smells of tar, salt and oranges freshly unloaded from a crate. Around you, sailors haul sacks of sugar, crates of tea, barrels of rum. The clatter of chains, the cries of gulls, the whistle of steamships, all blend into a restless hum. Each sound is a reminder that food, even something as small as a cube of sugar, often travelled thousands of miles before reaching a cup of tea. Tea, above all, defined the Victorian era. By the 1830s, it had become an everyday ritual, no longer just a luxury for the wealthy. Black teas from China, and later India and Ceylon were shipped in vast quantities. Imagine the first sip, hot, slightly bitter, softened by milk and sweetened by sugar. For many it was less a drink than a comfort, a pause in the day's labour, and sugar, how much depended on it. Whole industries thrived on its trade, carried from plantations in the Caribbean. Sweetness became not only a flavour but a marker of status. A guest offered tea without sugar might well feel slighted. Isn't it curious how something so small could carry so much weight? Spices, too, filled the air of Victorian kitchens. Cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, brought from colonies far away, folded into cakes and puddings until they became traditional English flavours, though their roots were anything but. Imagine a Christmas pudding, dense with fruit and spice, the air thick with its fragrance. Each bite a taste of far-off shores. There were stranger imports as well. Bananas, once a novelty, arrived wrapped carefully in leaves, carried by ship and rail until they reached English markets. Imagine the wonder of biting into such a fruit for the first time. Soft, sweet, and utterly unlike an apple or pear. Pineapples, as we've seen, were so rare they were rented, their spiky crowns displayed like jewels at tables. Curry, too, became part of the Victorian palate, though often altered heavily to suit English tastes. A recipe from 1845 advised adding cream and less spice to make the dish more agreeable. Picture the golden sauce simmering gently, served with rice that had also travelled oceans to arrive on the table. Isn't it curious how travel softened flavours, reshaped them, made them familiar? And there were foods brought not only for the wealthy, but for survival. Salt cod from Newfoundland, for instance, fed workers in cities far from the sea. Hard, dry, needing long soaking before it could be eaten, it was hardly glamorous. But it sustained countless families. Empire carried luxuries, yes, but also staples, plain and practical. Close your eyes now and picture the cargo hold of a Victorian ship. Barrels stacked high, the air thick with the scent of spices mingling with salt and tar. Sailors rest against sacks of rice, their clothes dusted white from grain. The sea creaks and groans around them, carrying food that will shape kitchens hundreds of miles away. There is humour in it too. Some travellers wrote in letters home about banana incidents, with fruit ripening too quickly in transit and filling cabins with a smell so overpowering that passengers fled to the deck. Imagine the comedy of it. The fruit meant to impress instead, spoiling in heaps, swarming with flies. Yet beneath the humour lies something tender. Every shipment carried with it stories of longing, for home, for comfort, for taste. Sailors brought spices to remind them of ports they'd left behind. Immigrants carried seeds from home to plant in foreign soil, and families in England tasted, perhaps for the first time, something that spoke of a world far beyond their reach. And so, empire reshaped the dinner table. Each bite of pudding, each spoon of curry, each sip of tea was not only a taste but a connection. Threads of flavour binding continents together. Isn't it soothing in a strange way to think that food always carries stories across oceans, stitching lives together bite by bite? Now let the sails drop, the sea grow quiet, the crates unloaded, the harbour fade. From Empire's reach, we return again to the heart of the household, where food was not only exotic or grand, but deeply ordinary, the simple daily meals that kept life steady. Not every Victorian meal was a banquet or a curiosity from abroad. Most often, food was plain, practical, predictable, the kind that quietly filled bellies and marked the rhythm of each day. And there's something soothing about that predictability, isn't there? A comfort in meals that repeat steady as clock hands. Breakfast, for instance, was often simple but hearty. For the working poor, it might be just bread and dripping, the cooled fat from roasted meat spread on a crust. The taste was salty, savoury, a reminder of yesterday's feast, however small. Others might begin the day with porridge, thick and steaming, a bowl held close against the chest for warmth on cold mornings. Picture the steam rising, spoons scraping against earthenware, the silence of dawn broken only by the clink of cutlery. For the middle classes, breakfast stretched further. Bacon sizzling, eggs frying, toast by the fire, tea poured into cups, butter melting on bread, newspapers unfolded at the table, sometimes even ironed flat beforehand as we've mused to keep ink from smudging. Imagine sitting there, tea in one hand, toast in the other, the morning sun faint through the lace curtains. Midday brought dinner, though the word has shifted since then. For many, dinner at noon was the main meal, a stew of beef and vegetables perhaps, or a boiled joint of meat carved carefully to stretch across days. Stews were the backbone of working families, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. Each pot was its own story, a little barley here, a few turnips there, scraps of meat saved from Sunday's roast. By late afternoon, tea time arrived, and while grand afternoon teas of captured imagination, silver trays, scones, cakes, cucumber sandwiches, for most families it was far simpler. Bread with butter, maybe jam if fortune allowed, and always the comfort of hot tea. Can't you picture it? Children gathering around, feet swinging from chairs, steam curling upward as the day's light faded. Supper, taken later in the evening, was often plainest of all. Cold leftovers, bread with cheese, perhaps a simple broth. For workers returning late, it was less ceremony than necessity, a quiet end to long days. Imagine a candle flickering, a plate of bread set down, the day's exhaustion softening into silence with each bite. The flavours were plain, yes, but sometimes plainness itself is calming. A potato boiled until soft, sprinkled with salt. A carrot roasted, its sweetness deepened by fire. These are foods that asked for little, that gave without pretension. Isn't there comfort in that kind of honesty? Of course, there were small luxuries even in ordinary meals. A spoonful of treacle drizzled over porridge, a slice of apple tucked into a pie, a scrap of bacon fried until crisp and shared among many. Small things, but enough to spark a smile. There is humour, too, in how repetitive meals could be. One diary from 1865 noted, almost in complaint, "We have had mutton thrice this week, and shall again tomorrow. I grow quite weary of it." And yet the family continued. Because mutton was affordable, dependable, always at hand. Imagine joking at the table, "Mutton again?" and then eating it all the same. For children, meals were remembered less for monotony than for treats. The promise of pudding after Sunday dinner, the thrill of jam spread thick on bread, the sticky fingers that followed. These moments glowed in memory, softening the plainness of porridge and bread. Close your eyes now, and picture a small Victorian family seated around a wooden table. The father with his bowl of stew, the mother slicing bread, children spooning porridge with sleepy eyes. The air smells of onions and broth. The fire crackles low, the night is cool beyond the windows. There is no grandeur here, but there is steadiness, and sometimes that is sweeter than feasts. Everyday meals carried families forward, day after day, season after season. They were less about indulgence than endurance, less about spectacle than survival. And yet, in their plainness, they created rhythm, comfort, belonging. And as the plates are cleared, the fire banked low, the family drifts towards sleep, their hunger softened for another night. Let us drift too onward now from the table of the ordinary to the hush of late-night hunger, the secret snacks and midnight nibbles that made even the quietest hours a little warmer. The lamps are dimmed, the streets outside quiet, and most of the household has long since drifted into dreams. Yet, even in Victorian times, night could stir appetites. Small cravings, gentle as whispers, calling for something more before sleep deepened. Imagine the great house at rest. Servants tucked away in their quarters, masters in bed, the fires burning low. The silence is broken only by the faint tick of a clock, the occasional creak of beams settling, and yet from time to time a door opens, footsteps pad softly down the hall, and someone seeks a midnight morsel. For the wealthy, such snacks might be left prepared by thoughtful servants. A plate of biscuits on a sideboard, a jug of milk cooled in the larder, a small meat pie covered with cloth. These were foods meant to be eaten cold without fuss, requiring no noisy pots or rattling pans. Picture the quiet thrill of lifting a cloth to reveal a golden pie, slicing a piece by candlelight, savouring it in silence while the house slumbers. For servants, the midnight snack was more secretive. Rules forbade raiding the pantry, but hunger is stubborn, especially after long days of labour. A slice of bread stolen quietly, A corner of cheese nibbled in the shadows, perhaps a spoonful of cold pudding saved from dinner. Imagine the warmth of such a small rebellion, the sweetness of stolen food magnified by the thrill of secrecy. In boarding schools and modest households too, midnight hunger found its ways. Boys might sneak apples beneath their beds, crunching quietly under blankets. Girls might share biscuits by candlelight, giggling softly until a teacher's step in the hall sent them scurrying into silence. Isn't there something timeless in that? The joy of eating something forbidden, hidden in the hush of night. The Victorians even had names for such indulgences: supper biscuits, nightcaps, sleeping draughts. Some believed a little warm milk, flavoured with nutmeg or cinnamon, could ease restlessness. Picture a cup cradled in hands, steam curling upward, the warmth seeping slowly into a drowsy body until sleep returned like a tide. There's humour too in the advice of the day. One 1870s guide sternly warned against eating heavy foods late at night, claiming they caused disturbed dreams and unwholesome fancies. And yet, diaries tell of people happily tucking into cheese meat pies or leftover puddings at midnight. Perhaps bad dreams were a price worth paying for comfort. Midnight hunger also revealed the intimacy of food. A husband rising quietly to fetch bread and butter for a restless wife. A mother soothing a child's cries with warm broth in the small hours. These moments were unrecorded, uncelebrated, but deeply human. Food as comfort, not feast. Close your eyes and picture it. The larder door opening with a soft creak, candlelight spilling over shelves lined with jars and tins. The air is cool, filled with scents of spice and sugar, smoke and salt. A hand reaches for something small, a biscuit, a piece of fruit, a slice of bread. And for a moment the quiet of night is broken by the crunch, the chew, the sigh of satisfaction. Isn't it calming to know that even in centuries past people woke in the night with the same small cravings we do now? That hunger, simple and human, tied them to us across time. And so, the midnight snack becomes not just food but ritual, a quiet rebellion against routine, a soft comfort in silence, a reminder that life is sweet even in its smallest bites. Now the candle is snuffed, the crumbs brushed away, the door closed again. The house sinks back into silence, and sleep settles deeper. Let your thoughts wander with it, carrying you forward to the next curious corner of Victorian life. Not the snacks of midnight, but the medicines of the table, the strange belief that food itself could heal nearly anything. The Victorians, like many before them, believed that food was not just sustenance but medicine. Every sip, every bite might soothe, restore, or even heal. And as odd as some of their ideas now seem, there's something strangely comforting in the thought that the kitchen could double as a kind of pharmacy, the pantry as a cabinet of cures. Picture a Victorian home where someone coughs by the fire. Instead of reaching for pills, the family prepares hot milk with honey, perhaps laced with a pinch of nutmeg. The warmth coats the throat, the sweetness soothes, and for a time relief arrives. Even now, doesn't the idea sound familiar? A remedy passed quietly across generations, as steady as the tick of the clock. For colds, broth was a common cure. A chicken boiled until tender, the resulting soup rich and steaming, believed to drive away chills and restore strength. Imagine holding a bowl close, the aroma of onion and herb rising, the heat warming not just the body but the spirit. Milk itself was praised as almost miraculous. Physicians in the 1860s prescribed milk diets for everything from indigestion to nervousness. Patients might be told to drink glass after glass, warm, cold, sometimes even mixed with soda water. There's a humorous image there. A Victorian patient dutifully sipping milk at all hours, convinced it was restoring balance. Oatmeal too was praised as a tonic for the weary. A food for invalids, one guide called it, noting its ability to strengthen without burdening. Picture a patient spooning porridge slowly, each bite soft and bland, yet served with tender care. And then there were the stranger remedies. Beef tea, for example. Thin broth made by simmering meat for hours until only its essence remained. Doctors recommended it for the weak and sickly, though by most accounts it tasted faint and unappealing. Imagine sipping hot water flavoured only faintly of beef. Hardly delicious, yet offered as though it held life itself. There is humour in the quackery too. Some Victorian advertisements claimed chocolate could cure melancholy, or that biscuits fortified with phosphates could restore vitality. Isn't it amusing to think of a biscuit promising to improve your mood, as though happiness could be baked in like sugar? Alcohol was often prescribed as well. A little sherry for the faint, a stout for the weak, brandy for the ill. Doctors wrote such instructions without hesitation, though one wonders if patients were sometimes happier for the dose of comfort than for any true cure. Picture a weary worker being told a glass of porter daily for health, and smiling at the prescription. Herbs and spices carried their place too. Cloves pressed against a toothache, ginger tea for nausea, cinnamon to warm the blood. These small comforts bridged the gap between kitchen and cure, blending necessity with ritual. Close your eyes now and imagine a quiet sick room. Curtains drawn, the air hushed. A tray brought in with broth, milk, or tea. Perhaps a small biscuit at the side. The clink of the cup, the warmth against tired hands, the slow sip that eases not only pain but loneliness. Isn't there something gentle in the thought that healing could be offered in such small, tender ways? The belief that food could cure shaped Victorian kitchens deeply. Recipes were written not only for flavour but for health. Advice passed from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, mingled taste with remedy. And though modern medicine has left behind many of these notions, the comfort of food as care remains. Even now, when we sip broth for a cold or take honey for a sore throat, we echo those old rhythms. Food heals not always by chemistry but by comfort, and sometimes that is enough. And as the patient drifts into rest, soothed by broth, warmed by milk, or cheered by a sip of brandy, let us drift too. The sick room fades, and with it the notion of cure through food. Ahead lies something more festive, more communal, the great gatherings of the Victorian table, where food was not medicine but celebration. The Victorians loved display, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their great feasts and banquets. Imagine entering a grand dining hall, the air warm with the mingling scents of roasted meats, spiced puddings, and polished wood. Chandeliers drip with light, silver gleams on long tables, and every detail whispers of wealth, power, and abundance. At the heart of these gatherings stood the table itself, not merely a surface for eating, but a stage for performance. Dishes were arranged in elaborate symmetry, tall centerpieces rising like sculptures, fruits piled high in careful pyramids, sugar spun into shapes of flowers or temples. The meal began before the first bite was taken, with the eyes feasting on order, colour, and extravagance. Picture a Victorian banquet in 1851, during the Great Exhibition's flush of grandeur. The Prince Consort himself seated at a table groaning with venison, salmon, capons, and puddings. Around him, lords and ladies in silks and satins, their forks poised like actors in a play. Each course arrived with ceremony, servants gliding silently, dishes unveiled with a flourish. For the middle classes, who longed to imitate such style, feasts were more modest but carried the same ambition. A Christmas dinner, for instance, might feature roast goose or beef, potatoes browned in dripping, and of course the Christmas pudding, dense, rich, fragrant with spice, flamed with brandy. The pudding alone could be a showpiece carried into the room alight, drawing gasps and cheers. There was humour too in these displays. Accounts described tables so crowded with dishes that guests struggled to reach their plates. One writer complained in 1860 that he nearly lost his hand in the forest of silver tureens. Imagine leaning over endless platters, hoping not to knock over a tower of blancmange. The feasts were not only about food but about time. Meals stretching for hours, course after course, conversation weaving between each bite. Imagine sipping soup, then fish, then meat, then pudding, the hours melting like wax from a candle. For guests, the meal was an experience, a world in itself. But feasts also carried their contrasts. While tables in great houses gleamed, many in poorer homes celebrated with only what they could spare. A goose shared among a large family, potatoes as the centerpiece, perhaps a small pudding made with scraps of suet, and yet the joy was no less. Laughter around a crowded table, children reaching for bread, parents smiling at full bellies. Isn't there comfort in the thought that feasts, no matter their scale, offered belonging more than spectacle? Think of the sounds. Knives against plates, glasses clinking, voices rising in cheer, the steady rhythm of courses served and cleared. Beneath it all, the soft hum of fires, the clatter of dishes below stairs, the unseen labour that made the feast possible. Close your eyes and picture sitting at such a table. A plate before you, silver polished, a dish steaming, the scent of nutmeg and roast filling the air. Around you, faces glow in candlelight. Conversation hums, laughter rises. The feast is not just food, but fellowship. A tapestry of sights, sounds, and tastes woven into memory. Victorian feasts revealed much about the age. Its hunger for display, its love of ritual, its belief that food could be both nourishment and narrative. Each banquet was a story told in courses, each dish a sentence in a larger tale. And when the final course is cleared, the candles gutter low, and guests drift into the night, the memory of abundance lingers. For us too, that glow remains, a reminder that food has always been more than eating. It is gathering, sharing, celebrating. And as we leave the hall, stepping softly away from chandeliers and silver, let us wander toward quieter paths. Ahead lies not the roar of feasts, but the small fading traditions of Victorian food, the recipes, customs, and quirks that lingered even as the century closed. Every age has its rituals that slowly slip away, fading like twilight. The Victorian world, with all its bustle and invention, also carried little traditions of the table that endured long after their time seemed past. They were small, sometimes peculiar, but cherished, threads binding people to comfort, habit, and memory. Take, for instance, the ritual of toasting bread at the fire. Even as gas stoves spread in the 1880s, families still held bread to the flame on long forks, waiting for it to brown. The smell of toast mingling with smoke was more than flavour. It was a memory stitched into evenings. Can you picture it? The soft crackle of fire, the glow on the bread's edges, the satisfaction of butter melting into the crisp surface. Or think of the insistence on Sunday roasts, even when money was tight. A joint of meat, however small, roasted in the oven while the family gathered. The rhythm of the week seemed incomplete without it. Diaries from the 1890s tell of mothers stretching a single roast across several meals, transforming it into stew, pies, and broth. The tradition mattered more than the abundance. There were curious superstitions too. Some believed breaking bread by hand rather than cutting it brought better fortune. Others thought that stirring Christmas pudding should always be done east to west, in honour of the three wise men. Children joined in, each making a wish as they stirred. Imagine a small hand gripping a spoon, stirring slowly, whispering a hope into the spiced air. Tea carried its rituals as well. Though tea bags had not yet appeared, the act of brewing was itself a ceremony. Warming the pot, measuring the leaves, pouring the water just so. In poorer homes, leaves might be used twice, even thrice, but the ritual remained. Isn't it soothing to think of how something so ordinary could be elevated into a pause, a moment of care? Some traditions were fading by then. Ironing newspapers, once common in great houses to prevent ink stains, was mocked in later decades as fussy. Jelly towers and moulded blancmanges, once showpieces, gave way to simpler desserts. And yet, the memory of these things lingered like echoes. There is gentle humour in the stubbornness of habit. One elderly gentleman in 1895 reportedly refused to eat dinner without mustard on the table, whether or not the food suited it. Another insisted his soup always be served at precisely the same temperature, timing his servant with a pocket watch. Such quirks were less about necessity than about the comfort of ritual. Close your eyes and imagine the fading century. Gas lamps glowing, horse hooves muffled in the street, families gathered in kitchens that smelled of tea, bread, and broth. The world was changing, railways rushing, factories rising, and but at the table old customs still held on. A spoon stirred, bread broke, tea poured. These small things grounded lives amidst the swirl of modernity. And isn't it true that we too carry small rituals forward? The way we brew our coffee, the way we slice fruit, the snacks we turn to at certain hours. They may seem trivial, but they are the quiet architecture of daily life. The Victorians knew this, even if they didn't name it. So these traditions, fading but persistent, remind us that food is not only about survival or spectacle, it is also about continuity, the small repeated gestures that keep memory alive. And as the century turns, as electric light begins to glow and the old ways slip gently into shadow, let us follow them into the final pages of this journey. Ahead lies not another custom or feast, but reflection. The soft close of a story, the gentle settling of memory into dream. The tale of Victorian kitchens has carried us through so many rooms, hasn't it? From grand banquet halls filled with chandeliers and silver, to modest cottages where bread and broth were stretched across the week. We have peeked into pantries at midnight, listened to the hum of kettles on the hob, and even imagined servants carefully ironing newspapers before they dared to read them. Each chapter has been a step deeper into that world, until it feels almost familiar, almost close enough to touch. Now, in this last stretch, let me invite you to rest in reflection. Imagine sitting by a fire, not a grand roaring blaze, but a small steady one. The room is warm but dim, the only light the glow of embers. On the table rests a pot of tea, a plate with the last crumbs of cake, perhaps a glass of milk, warm and faintly sweet. The house is quiet, the streets outside hushed, and time itself seems to slow. In moments like these, the Victorians too found peace. Their lives may have been crowded with rituals, customs, and odd beliefs, but beneath it all was the same longing we know today, the longing for comfort, for belonging, for the soothing rhythm of shared food and quiet nights. Think of the patterns we've traced, the way people found delight in puddings, or rebellion in a midnight snack, the way feasts dazzled with spectacle while the smallest rituals, stirring pudding, buttering toast, pouring tea, carried just as much meaning. Isn't it curious how often the simplest moments linger longest in memory? And then there is the tenderness of it all. A child given warm milk to ease sleep, a weary worker sipping broth after a long day, families gathered around tables whether rich or poor, finding laughter in shared meals. These gestures crossed class and circumstance, stitching lives together with the quiet thread of food. It is easy to smile at the strangeness, ironing newspapers, sipping beef tea, believing biscuits could cure melancholy. Yet even these oddities reveal something soft, a desire for order, comfort, and care in a world that often felt uncertain. And perhaps that's why their story feels so gentle to tell at night, because it reminds us of our own small comforts, the rituals that make us feel safe. So let us leave the Victorians now, not in the bustle of a feast or the clang of kitchens below stairs, but here in stillness, with a soft cup of tea and the warmth of memory. Let us thank them for their curiosities, their customs, their foods both odd and familiar, and let us carry forward what matters most, the knowledge that in every age food is more than food. It is comfort, care, and the quiet poetry of daily life. The fire grows lower, the air grows cooler, and sleep draws near. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Breathe softly. Let the hum of these stories fade into the background of your thoughts, like the last notes of a lullaby. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. If you drifted off, let me know below. Sweet dreams, friend. And now in a whisper, I'll leave you for the night. Until next time.